Amen. All right, we're going to be in chapter 2 this morning. One of the ways that teachers are taught how to teach is through several methods. One of those is by method of asking questions. And if you're in the teaching profession, and you can look this kind of stuff up on the internet, there is a lot that is said about the best way, the effective way, how to ask questions so that your students are engaged, that they think, that they're not bored, et cetera, okay? So chapter 2, I don't know if you've noticed this, but chapter 2 is just a series of questions, and the questioner in this case is God. Now, one of the things that you ever think you try to do sometime, and take you quite a while, but just go through and list the questions in the Bible that God asks, and they're always very deep and informative if we answer them. It starts with the very first question that God asked way back in the garden: where are you? So you think about how God would ask questions and the answer would cause you to think. Well, it's the same thing that's happening here in chapter 2. All right, so just to kind of demonstrate that to you, let's just real quickly go down the chapter and look at the questions, okay? So the first one is in verse 5. What's the question there? Anybody? Pardon? Yeah, what's the just what is the question that's being asked there? That's in verse 5? No, verse 5. Sorry about that. Verse 5. I may have said question 5, excuse me. Okay, all right, that's the first. What injustice did your fathers find in me that they went far away from me? All right, let's go down to the next one. It's in verse 11. What's the question that you find in verse 11?
The nation never changed. It's God.
All right, let's keep going down to verse 14. Yeah, is he a homeborn servant? Has he become a prey? All right, question number 4 down in verse 17. Have you not brought this on yourself? Next verse, question number 5, if you're making a list, is in verse 18. Yeah, and Egypt. What are you doing dealing with those two nations? We'll talk about that when we get to it. Going down to verse 21. This is.
Then did you turn against me into a corruption and wild vine?
Okay, how did you become a wild vine or a foreign vine? We'll talk about that when we get to it. Question number 7 down in verse 23.
How can you say I am not polluted? I have not gone after Baal.
All right, let's keep going down to the next one I had is in verse 28. Where's these gods you made? All right, there's a little bit of irony there in that question that we'll talk about. Question number 9 down in verse 29. Why do you contend with me? And we'll talk about that, what that means. Question number 10 down in the end of verse 31. All right. And then the next question is right after that in verse 32.
Does a maiden forget her jewelry, a bride her wedding ornament?
Okay, all right. And then I think the last one that I had anyway in this chapter that I found was in verse 36.
Why you go about so much changing your ways?
Okay, so you see what I'm getting at. From top to bottom, this chapter, you could just label it God's questions to his people. And they're all set in a discussion that's very personal. Okay, you notice that. Why are you doing this to me? Why have you done this? Why are you going away? Why, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the general lean of the whole chapter. God is asking these questions of his people who have gone in the wrong direction. And he's trying to, if they'll answer the questions, it should cause them to rethink their position and change. All right, that's the other part of this. It's not just asking questions because God has the right to ask them, but it's ideally to get them to think about the answer and change. For example, where are the gods that you made? When things got really bad, did these gods help them? No. So why do you keep serving them? You know, that's the kind of deal. All right, that's the reason these questions appear. Okay, questions or comments before we move on? Anybody?
I just noticed in verse 13, before he starts asking all those questions, he tells them exactly what they've done.
Yes. Yeah.
And then he follows it up with the questions to make them.
Okay, all right, that's right. All right, well, let's start off here, and we're going to take this in chunks. First chunk I'm taking, and your Bible may break things down like this. If it does, it always helps. But verses 1 through 3 is kind of the where we start here with the word of the Lord coming to Jeremiah. And where's Jeremiah going to be saying all this message? Where are we told in these verses? Where? Judah, but specifically there in verse 2, what does it say? Jerusalem. All right? So Jeremiah is going to be in Jerusalem speaking to whoever is going to be there, and we'll see some of those folks are identified in this chapter. And what is the I guess, human, I don't know how to describe it. In verse 2, it talks about a certain situation that exists among humans. Maybe that's the best way to ask it. What is he talking about there? Yeah, that's exactly right. Because he talks about betrothal, right? Closest thing we have to it's nothing really we have exactly like what they had then, but engagement is kind of a poor second comparison to betrothal that existed at that time. But anyway, God is basically saying, I remember back during that time. Okay, he's kind of causing the people in their minds to go back to when this betrothal period was. And we may not understand what exactly that time is until you read the end of verse 2, and then you get a few clues as to what time that was. And what would you say based on that he's talking about?
Back in the wilderness,
And when would that be?
they were his bride to start with, the land, and then the land had been sown,
Right.
and they trusted him. He provided food, water for them and all, and guided them through the wilderness.
So we're talking about what period of history in Israel? The Exodus. Yeah, he's going way back. Way back. And God's saying essentially that was the betrothal period when he led them through that difficult time. Okay, Robin?
I was just going to add, what you did get in verse 3 also, when they brought them out of the land and then he established them as a nation and they were faithful, those were the best of times. And when anybody came against them and tried to attack them, God punished them.
Okay, all right.
So it was a perfect time for the children of Israel.
Okay, all right. And that goes, verse 3 describes that. Israel was what to the Lord? Holy to the Lord. All right. And it describes them as something related to Old Testament practice there. What is that? All right. Does anybody know anything about that? Of what? The harvest. Yes, that's right. It's exactly what it sounds like. You had a fruit tree, and in spring, after it had bloomed and developed fruit, when the fruit became ripe, the first and the best of your fruit was offered to God. Okay? And what he describes there in verse 3 is what happens if somebody were to not devote that to God, but to take it for themselves. And he describes that as somebody who becomes guilty, and then evil came upon them when they did that. So if Israel was his first fruits, and somebody tried to take that, some foreign power or whatever, God dealt with them. Okay? That's the idea that he's giving there. Okay, so everything was presented there. And of course, we know the history of that time, right? They weren't perfect. There was all kind of problems when they were in the wilderness. and in those early days of Judges and in the first king. I mean, it was one problem after another. But it's interesting, God looking back on that is saying, yeah, there were problems, but they were still holy to me. They were still pointed generally in the right direction, in other words, okay? Okay.
They did ask when they, if I remember, they did ask for forgiveness when they did something back then. And that other times gonna come when these people didn't know God, they didn't ask for no forgiveness.
All right.
Back in us, when they were in the wilderness and all that under the, we was talking about that they asked for forgiveness.
All right, great point. Did everybody hear that? At least they had enough to know when God would come to them and say, you're wrong, they would change. And as we're going to get into Jeremiah, we're going to see exactly what Brother Don described. There comes a point when the people don't want to change. They don't care. Jeremiah's going to come to them, tell them where they're wrong. If they'll change, God will bless them. They just ignore it. They didn't do anything. Yep. Okay, let's go on down to this next section, unless somebody has something you want to add to that. Okay, so here comes the first question that we mentioned a while ago. What injustice did your fathers find in me that they went far from me and walked in the emptiness and became empty? That's kind of an interesting play on words, isn't it? The things they were doing that were wrong caused them to be just as wrong. In other words, that's kind of the idea. But what's the implied answer to the question? What injustice did they find in him? There wasn't any. That's exactly right. The implied answer there is there was no injustice. So in other words, here is God, you might say in a relational question to his people, saying, what was it you found in me that caused you to go far from me? And if they'll think about that, the obvious answer being there wasn't anything, then it should cause them to think about, well, why did we go away from him? It doesn't make any sense, really, does it? Okay? Yes. Yes. Exactly. All right, great point. He goes on in verse 6 to elaborate on this. They did not say, and who would they be, by the way? Yeah, these people he's talking about that decided to go far away from him. They did not say, where is the Lord who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, who led us through the wilderness, through the land of deserts, and all those things he described there in verse 6. So what does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? They didn't say this. What is implied there? Okay. All right. Somebody else? Let's think about it this way. Okay. They didn't ask the question because they didn't have to ask it, did they? When they were in the wilderness and they were being led through these areas, did they ever really have to say, where is God? I mean, they would complain and ask the question in the wrong way, right? You know, you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us. And that was basically accusing God of an injustice. But when they were being brought up out of the land and they didn't have water, did God provide them water? Yes. Did God provide them food? Yes. Did God provide them everything they needed? So they really never had to ask that question, okay? And I think that's the point he's trying to make here. Verse 7, he goes on, he says, I brought you to the fruitful land. We know that story, the land of Canaan. And then what did they do with it? All right, so here's the injustice, and I think that's the point he's trying to make. God, back up in verse 5, says, what injustice did you find in me? Well, none. But here's the injustice I find in you. I gave you a good land, you defiled it. Now that's an injustice. All right, so that's the kind of the play on ideas that he's making here. He keeps going on in verse 8. The priest did not say, where is the Lord? And those who handle the law did not know me. What does that imply? Specifically that last phrase when he says, those who handle the law did not know me. What does he mean by that? All right, that's the first thing.
The ERV version says, people who know the law did not want to know me.
Okay,
Scribes, if they wrote this, even though they wrote it, they still didn't believe it.
okay, all right. What else? Okay, all right. When we talk about when he says didn't know me, what does that not mean? Did they just not know who Jehovah was? That's not what it meant, did it? They knew that, right? So what did it mean to know him? Exactly. Yes. This is not just book knowledge, right? This is personal, relational knowledge with someone that goes beyond just the surface. Sir? You seek him, all right. And the people teaching the law, I think what's implied here is they should have had that and didn't. Okay? Maybe they could have just taught the commands from an academic point of view and just gone on, and then they forgot about it and violated them, whatever. But the idea here is someone teaching the law who actually knew God in that intimate way. Now he addresses another group there in verse 8, and that's the rulers, and he says, what about them? They transgressed. Here they were responsible for carrying out God's law, and they just did something different, all right? What about the prophets? What did they do wrong? They didn't prophesy by God. They went somewhere else, okay? And walked after things that did not profit. So the injustice here was not with God. I think that whole section speaks to the injustice by his people, but not with God.
It's just interesting to me when it says those that held the law did not know him. Given the context, Josiah had found the law, so they got to the point that they had completely ignored it, didn't know what it said, and weren't teaching.
Okay?
It has really become rotten at that point.
All right. Great point. Anybody else?
And I think he put it on the people themselves and on the priests and the prophets. It wasn't just, well, they're not teaching you, so you understand everything now. He put it on both of them. Both sets should have known.
Great point. All right. Yeah, nobody's exempt here, right? Tim?
Obviously, nothing has changed today. That's all these group of people, what have I done to make you not follow the same obvious principle?
Okay. All right. All right, let's look at this next section, verses 9 through 13. And how does it start there in verse 9? What's the first statement? Therefore, I will do what? Yours says charges, Don?
It says bring charges.
Bring charges against you. All right. And New American Standard says contend. Anybody have anything different? Plead your case. All right. So what arena are we kind of in when we hear those words? It sounds like a legal proceeding, right? Not so much with the word contend, but with plead your case and all that, you definitely seem like you're in the legal arena. So God's basically saying, I've got a case against you, and I'm going to argue it or contend with you about it. Okay? Now, why this is significant, we'll get to it here in a few moments. If you drop down to verse 29, what does it say there? This is one of our questions. It says, will you?
Not will you. You will plead with me.
You will plead with me? Okay. My version says, why do you contend with me? So the point being, I think, if you compare those two, God's the one that's got the case. It's not the other way around, right? It's not them that have a case against God. Okay. All right, well, let's go on here in this section 9 through 13. He says, I will contend with you, and with your sons I will contend. And then he brings up two places here in verse 10, Kittim and Kedar. And what's the point of that? What do those two places represent? First of all, where are they? Okay, all right. I think I got something different. Maybe I looked up the wrong thing. Anybody get anything else there? I think the idea basically is from the north to the south. One of these, I think Kittim was north of Israel, and it may have been an island, Robin, up near Tyre, somewhere like that. And Kedar was south. I think that's, and maybe I looked up the wrong thing here. But anyway, the idea is here is remote places, top to bottom, you might say. And he tells them to send to those places and ask the question that we've noticed in verse 11, and that is what? What's the question again? All right, and what's the implied answer? No. And then he actually makes a point that may not come out as clear, but what nations is he talking about here? Is he talking about nations that worship the true God? He's talking about pagan nations, right? So the irony is, here are nations that are worshiping pagan false gods, but they don't change their gods. They stick with them through thick and thin. And here's Israel worshiping the true God, but what had they done? Yeah, they changed their mind and went a different direction. Okay, so that's kind of a point I think he's trying to make here. My people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. That's the summation of what they did when they tossed the true God for their pagan ones. And that's why you get the pronouncement in verse 12 after that happened. Be appalled, O heavens, at this, and shudder and be very desolate, declares the Lord. And then he goes on in the context talking about this change of gods to describe the two evils in verse 13. And what are those two evils?
I got ingratitude and folly.
All right. That's a good way to describe what they did. All right, very good. All right. What's evil number one? They forsook God. All right. That's the changing gods that the pagan nations didn't do, right? But they didn't stop there, right? They didn't just say, we're not going to be for the Lord anymore. The second thing they did, or the second evil, was to do what? Okay, and the cistern was used to do what? All right, so they built cisterns, but they built cisterns that couldn't hold water. And that goes along with the last thing that is said there in verse 13 about God himself. He says, they forsook me, a fountain of living water. And living water was a way of describing a springing water, fresh water, the best that you could have, really, okay? So here is that picture. God is this fountain of springing fresh water, and they tossed that for a cistern that won't hold water. And a cistern, of course, what happens to the water after it's been in there for a while? Not real good anyway, right? So the water, even if it held water, it wouldn't have been as good. But the cistern is broken, so it won't even hold water. So that's the folly. I think this is the word you use there, Don, to describe the change that they made. They had it so good and tossed it for something so idiotic. Okay? All right. Questions on that section, or anybody added comments? Yes, ma'am.
I went back to Jeremiah 1:16 for the second evil. They had offered sacrifices to other gods.
Okay. All right. And what did you say?
Jeremiah 1:16.
Mm-hmm.
They had forsaken me and had offered sacrifices to other gods and worshipped the works of their own hands.
Okay. All right. So we're just seeing that described in a little different way. Okay. All right, good. All right, let's go to this next section beginning in verse 14. And this is going to take us down through verse 19. What's the question he asked there in verse 14? It actually has the three parts, right? Question, is Israel a slave, or your version may say something different, servant? Question 2. Is he a homeborn slave? All right. Question 3. Why is he plundered? Okay. New American Standard says, why has he become a prey? And that's the same idea, basically. If you were around in that part of the world at that time and you were plundered, you were essentially the prey for whoever was doing this plundering, another nation. All right. So that's all that fits together. All right. So what's the implied answer? No. Actually, you might say the implied answer to the first two questions is no. The answer to the third part of that question, though, is what should have caused them to think, why are we in the situation that we're in right now? And when he says, why has he become a prey, or why has he been plundered? At that moment in time, northern 10 tribes are gone, and the Assyrians had already come through the land of Judah once and plundered it, almost taking it over, except God hadn't intervened and stopped it. So they've been plundered. That's the point. And they've had things taken away from them, land, cities, etc. So God's asking the question, why are you in that situation? And that should have caused them to think. Now, verse 15 kind of fits with this idea that he's been plundered and things that are happening to him. Young lions have roared at him. They've roared loudly. They made his land a waste. His cities have been destroyed without inhabitant. Verse 16 talks about the men of Memphis and Taphanes, and we talked about that last time. Those two cities reference what nation? Egypt, okay? And they have shaved the crown of your head. That's something that was done to people when they were taken captive or when they were conquered. And then we have the next question, you might say, in this context that he asked in verse 17, and that is what? You've done this to yourself. I mean, we're looking at the nation's history from God's point of view, and he's saying, you did this to yourself. Yes, God brought punishment on them, but only in response to what the choices they had made, right? So they had done this to themselves, and he goes on and elaborates on that in verse 17, by forsaking the Lord your God when he had done good for you, right? That's kind of the end of verse 17. God had done what for them? Yeah, he'd led them. He had always been there for the nation, doing good for them, and they still forsook him. All right, verse 18, he comes back to this idea of these nations around them, and he adds, well, let's just read that together. This is another one of our questions. But now, what are you doing on the road to Egypt to drink the waters of the Nile, or what are you doing on the road to Assyria to drink the waters of the Euphrates? What's the point of that question?
When you've got the best, why do you want something else?
Okay, that's part of it. All right, that's good. All right.
Going elsewhere for whatever your needs are. Everything's right here.
Okay, all right. At this moment in time, we're going to assume this is before the Babylonians have come calling. The two largest dominant powers around the nation were Assyria and Egypt. And you go back and read secular history, Assyria is basically going to be taken care of as the Babylonians come on the scene. They're going to go away. And that's going to leave Egypt. But before all that happens, if you were a small nation without a whole lot of an army, you would probably be very tempted to go form an alliance with one of these two nations as protection. And that's exactly what I think Jeremiah is describing here in verse 18. Why are you going there when you can come to God? That was the temptation Hezekiah faced, but Hezekiah basically threw himself on the mercy of God when they had no hope of being delivered from the Assyrians, and God delivered them. So they've got that in their history, but yet they're still looking to these other nations for help. And I think that's what he's talking about here in verse 18. Well, in response to that, God says, well, I don't have to do anything about correcting you because your own wickedness is going to do that. The apostates will reprove you. You'll know and see it's evil and bitter for you to forsake me, and the dread of me is not in you. In other words, God's protection is not in them, even if they go looking for help from these other nations. Okay, anything on that section before we move on to the next one? All right, let's look at verse 20. And again, we get more references to their history long ago. For long ago I broke your yoke. What do you think he's talking about there? Brought them out of bondage, yeah. Delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. And you get that pretty strongly in this verse, right? There's a lot of references to being delivered from slavery. I broke your yoke. I tore off your bonds. So now you've got a slave who's been delivered, and the slave, instead of in gratitude turning to the deliverer, what you get is the second part of verse 20, but you said, I will not serve. So that had been from God's point of view, the history of the nation. I delivered you, I gave you this land, and you didn't respond as you should have. Now, the latter part of verse 20, he describes what practice in kind of a metaphorical language. That's idolatry. How do we know that?
The high hills and the green trees and the sexual immorality that went with idolatrous worship.
All right, very good. Exactly right. This, a lot of these, what they called high places, and the Asherim poles and all that's probably being alluded to here at the end of verse 20. So we know we're still talking about idolatrous practices, okay?
He was actually calling them liars at that point. That you told me you said you would not leave me, that you would follow me, but look what you did.
Okay,
He didn't use the word, but I think that's what he was doing.
okay.
He said at one time, you would follow me.
All right, very good. All right, verse 21, now it seems he changes direction a little bit. He brings in a new metaphor or something to compare them to, and what is that? The vine, okay? So now, and this is not the first time or the only time that God refers to his nation that he built as if he were a farmer and they were a vineyard, okay? You can go back in Isaiah and read the Song of the Vineyard. That's another place where he talks about it. So what happened here? What does he describe has happened in verse 21?
I think he's saying, when I put you where I put you coming out of Egypt, you were a pure nation and you were holy to me. And now you've been corrupted by all the nations around you and all their gods.
Okay. All right, that's exactly right. That's the lesson that can be drawn from the picture described here. How does he describe the picture in verse 21?
Like he planted a rose bush and got dandelions.
Okay, that's right. That's right. I'm sorry? Okay, all right. I planted you a choice vine, a completely faithful seed. So here's you might say is the pure rootstock that was planted. Okay? And what grew up? A degenerate shoot of a foreign vine. Something that the farmer didn't want to happen, right? Okay? All right, so how does that fit into idolatry? Because that's where we started this section. Well, let's think about it this way, and I think goes back to what Robin said. Does this describe the history of the nation? They started out as a pure rootstock, planted as a choice vine. Yeah, God put his people in his land, and they grew. Time goes forward, and did what came out of that? Was it a pure, good vine that produced good fruit? No. The idolatry led them to become, as he describes here, degenerate, foreign vine, because they acted like the people around them, right? They were just as foreign as those pagan nations. So that's how that fits into this overall idea. Now, verse 22, he talks about they could try to wash all that idolatry off, but what does God say? That stain's still before me, okay? They really hadn't repented of it, in other words. Now, what was going through their mind, I think, is brought out by the question in verse 23. Evidently, they were saying what? Yeah. And then the latter part of that question is what? Or what do they say? I have not what?
They're saying they didn't go.
The Baals, all right? Which was, I don't know how they could say that. I mean, we just talked about, or Benjamin just pointed out in his lesson about Josiah. What did Josiah have to do as part of his reforms? Clean house. And what was he cleaning? What was he getting rid of? Yeah, all these idols and high places and all that. So how can you say I've not gone after the Baals? That just seems like delusional almost. And that's what he does after the question, doesn't he? Look at your way in the valley. Know what you've done. And then he describes their efforts to participate in this almost as akin to an animal that comes into heat. A wild donkey is what he says, who just can't be turned away from what they want. And in the case of the people of Israel, they had been practicing idols. They just couldn't be turned away. God sent them prophets He punished them, and they just kept on, never changed. Okay, was that our first bell? Second bell. All right, well, I'll stop there then. Any questions or observations, comments before we dismiss? All right, appreciate your attention. We'll pick up there Wednesday night.